At this point, it's time to dig into some basic principles of visual design. And while there are literally hundreds of those, I want to talk about what I call the Big Four. These are the four basic principles that we use to organize visual information, and they are alignment, proximity, repetition, and contrast. If you absorb nothing else, understand that these principles are the underlying factors in every single thing that we see and interact with. And whether that's on screen or in print or on a billboard, it really doesn't matter. These four principles are the underlying core of just about everything that we see and interact with. It's also important to understand that these principles are intimately interconnected. Whenever you're designing, you will never only apply one of these principles, okay? You will almost always be using some degree of all four, to be honest. And at the very least, you'll be using three of the four. So in anything that you do, even if you don't automatically recognize that it's happening, these four things absolutely come into play. And when a design is not working to some degree, it usually means that one of these four things is not happening, is not present, or is applied in a way contrary to the way it's supposed to work. We start with alignment because it's quite possibly the most important of the four principles. This is probably the rule that I see broken more often than any of the others. I'm here to tell you, if you do nothing but use proper alignment, your designs will be infinitely more useful, more usable, more understandable, and therefore more valuable. Take a look at this text. It's very easy to read for one very important reason. It has everything to do with the way that we track text, okay? It's kind of like the way old typewriters used to work, where you would type and the carriage moves to the right, and then when it's done, it returns to the left and you start over. We read the same way. We all read from top to bottom, left to right, with the exception of folks who are from other countries who may read in a different language and read right to left. But in this case, we're talking about the English language, and the way that's written is that we read left to right, okay? So we start at the left of the line, we go across, and then we start again at the left on the next line. What enables us to do that is this: the fact that there is a consistent point where we can track back to the left, okay? That allows us to really extraordinarily quickly get through these words and read multiple paragraphs. That tracking is what makes things easy to read. Now take a look at this text. Is it as easy to read? No, it isn't. And the reason it's not as easy to read is because take a look at where the tracking points are. They're all over the place. They're inconsistent. So it's very hard for us to automatically, unconsciously track back to the beginning of the line. We actually have to work to find the beginning of the next sentence. Because of that, a couple things happen. Number one, comprehension doesn't happen as fast. And number two, our eyes actually fatigue faster. And that's one of those cases where someone will be dealing with content on a screen or even on a piece of paper, quite frankly, and they'll sort of get annoyed, aggravated, frustrated, and they'll want to stop reading. And they may not be able to tell you why. They may see things like, I just couldn't read any more of that. And you'll say, well, why not? They'll say, I don't know. It was just frustrating me. All right. The reason is they're having to expend more energy than they should to have to read and comprehend that information because they can't easily track the lines. So centered text never works for reading. Don't center text ever. That's the best rule I can give you, okay? Just don't do it. Anytime you've got paragraphs, do not center align the text. I see this so often that, if I had a nickel for every time I've seen this approach used, I would be retired living on an island and I wouldn't be talking to you right now. Okay? It just doesn't work. For a single headline, maybe. For a single element, maybe. But when you've got multiple paragraphs like this, do not center text ever for any reason. Okay? I mean it. Here's another example of how alignment works. Even in a very busy layout, okay, there are a lot of elements on this screen. There's a lot of information for people to have to deal with, okay? This is a case where The client felt like they needed to be able to surface all these different parts, these different pieces of information, these different areas of what they do. Okay, but it becomes really challenging to, number one, just to fit it all on the screen. But number two, you've got to do it in a way where it's easy for people to move through it. And alignment goes a really, really, really long way in making all that somewhat easier to deal with, easier to get through, easier to jump from one place to the next without sort of being distracted by other stuff on the screen. Okay, and here's why. If you take a look at these lines that are on the screen, there are multiple things here that essentially align with other things. And some of that alignment may seem very consequential. Okay, you'll notice that sometimes, for instance, some of these vertical lines are where, an element of the left-hand edge of a block of text lines up with another element. Okay, this main paragraph up here in the middle lines up with the edge of the iPod graphic below it. If you look up even further, you'll see that the right edge of the A in the word Nexidia lines up with the left edge of the text. If you look down in the middle, you'll see that the baseline, meaning the bottom of the letters, in call centers lines up with user needs, lines up with events. If you go below that, you'll see that rich media lines up with witness users. Notice down here that this left rule lines up with the top of this image, lines up with the top of this text. Okay, so while they're not all the same element, aligning with the next same element, they're still aligned. There are still very clear visual paths for the eye to follow. So the bottom line is, all I'm trying to do when I design something like this is I'm trying to align everything with everything else in some way. There has to be some relationship between the elements. It doesn't have to be ideal. It doesn't have to be perfect. In other words, it doesn't have to be the bottom of this text aligns with the bottom of this text. It could be the bottom of this text aligns with the top of this image. Okay, two different things. But those relationships are what allow us to easily track through the stuff that we see. So what I'm getting at here is that alignment provides cognitive stability. It allows us to create visual relationships between the things that we see on the screen, and that allows us to track through those items much more quickly, much more easily. So every element in a design should be aligned with one or more other elements. Bottom line here, as I said, align everything. You can't go wrong, okay? Just look for relationships, even if it's, something that's on the extreme left side of the screen to the extreme right side of the screen. Look for a relationship. See if there's something that aligns, and if it does, or if the two things are very close together, adjust both elements so that there's a relationship. It seems like a goofy thing to do, but it goes a long way in allowing someone to sort of quickly grasp what's happening. Here's another example of the importance of alignment. This is a presidential ballot from the year 2000. And for those of you who remember that election, there was a lot of confusion and a lot of consternation and debate and fury over who won the election. And one of the things that a lot of people wonder is, did bad design decide the outcome? If you take a look at this ballot, you'll see that you have choices on two sides. Okay, on the left side you have choices, on the right side you have choices. All the holes that you're supposed to punch with this little tool that they give you are right down the center. And if you think about the principles that I just gave you of alignment, I think you'll see that it's not really clear which hole goes with which choice. This is extremely confusing. There's no totally obvious, clear alignment between the candidate selection and the choice for that selection. And the other problem is that all the little dots, the little circles, are too close together. It's very easy to sort of inadvertently punch one of the other ones. Now, as you look at this, consider a few things related to the outcome of this election. There were double votes for adjacent candidates, ones that were almost directly across from each other. A lot of those votes happened twice. There was an absolutely improbable number of votes for Pat Buchanan in Palm Beach County, which was extraordinarily liberal. Pat Buchanan is the most conservative of the conservative, all right? But he got an inordinate amount of votes from a county that has traditionally voted, in the last 20 years, very, very liberally. So that's sort of suspicious. And also, there were multiple instances where counts for candidates were wrong, okay? And then they recounted and they were wrong again. And then they recounted, the numbers still didn't match up. Okay, so there was all this confusion around tallying the results. Now, wouldn't this have been much easier? Take a look at that. Is there a clear relationship between the candidate that you are voting for and the area in which you make that selection? It's a one-to-one correlation. There's no confusion. This goes with this. This goes with this. Why? Because they are absolutely, unequivocally aligned perfectly. There is a clear visual relationship between the choice and the action. So not only do I think this is an excellent example of the power of alignment, I also think it's an excellent example of the potential consequence of not designing something properly. The second principle is proximity. Take a look at this layout. Does everything seem to be very well organized, very clear, very obvious? It does. And the reason it does has everything to do with proximity. The essential law of proximity is that elements that are visually close to each other are perceived as a single group, related to each other. When we look at things that are close to each other, we say, okay, that's all part of the same thing. This goes with this. So for instance, if I look at this left area where it says design and dev, it's immediately obvious to us at a glance that all these things, these 4 items, go together. They're all part of the same group. They all belong to the same categorization. And that is simply because of their proximity. If we look at the top menu item, we see these 2 arrow keys on the right, which are to go forward or backward. They're very close to each other. That's a single chunk of visual information. It's all very close. It almost forms one unit as you look at it, right? So we get it. Those are controls. That's forward, that's backward. They're related. If we look at the 3 articles that are right below that, again, they're all treated the same and they all share a space. They are closer to each other than they are to other things on the screen. Therefore, they're related. This black bar in the middle is very set apart from everything else, okay? It does not have close proximity to other things. Therefore, it sort of exists on its own, okay? It's not related to anything else. It's its own element. And as you can see, if you look at the content, it's a link, to some sort of voting mechanism, and almost like a banner ad. So because of its placement, because of the amount of space above it and below it, because of the distance of other elements related to it, it stands on its own. By the same token, the headline discussion underneath it has an awful lot of space above it and below it. And quite frankly, there's too much space from the baseline of the font to the area below it, because that headline belongs to all the snippets below it, right? These are the points of discussion. But it's treated in a way where it sort of stands on its own, as its own element. It doesn't have close proximity to anything. Its distance from that black bar is absolutely equal to the distance between it and the text below. So really what should happen is it should be moved down so that it has a closer proximity to that text below it. And of course, when we look at all this text down here, it's automatically related. It's all treated visually the same way, number one. But number two, all these items are very close to each other. Okay, so that's how proximity works. We make an automatic assumption, and it's unconscious, about relationships between items based on how close they are together. So unrelated items that are separated by negative space have different alignment paths, or they disrupt an existing path, right? We were sort of headed down this page from those 3 articles, and then we saw our black banner bar. Then we saw discussion, okay? Those exist as separate elements because they disrupt alignment paths. And by grouping certain design elements together, like navigation, like featured content, resource links, items in a footer, et cetera, those things form a whole, right? The navigation is the navigation, the header is the header, the footer is the footer, an article is an article, because it's all grouped, it's all in tight proximity. That's one of the ways that you signal to a user that, hey, all this stuff right here, it's all related. Here's another example of why proximity is important. Take a look at this contact form. In usability testing sessions, we find that forms like this typically take people a lot longer to fill out, and they sort of struggle a little bit with them. And the reason is that there's a significant gap between proximity of the label and the field. When we look at this, again, this has everything to do with perception, the way the brain works. When we look at this, we see all this stuff as a single element. And then because of the proximity of the fields, we see all this stuff as a single element. In other words, cognitively, it's difficult to make a clear relationship between the label and the field that goes with it. That's because of the distance between the two. There's too much of a gap there. Not only that, but the gap isn't consistent. Notice the distance between the first line, preferred contact number, and that little home drop down versus, the distance between work and the field that goes with it. Okay, that's a football field between those two things. So a better way to present this form would be something like this. The label comes immediately before the element that goes with it. Notice that when they're a lot closer together, it's extremely easy to make an instant association between the label and the field that goes with it. If you go down, you'll also notice that everything is aligned, right? Remember alignment? Everything is aligned to the left. So I can sort of track down in a very straight line and get through this form very quickly. I've also increased the proximity between the register and close buttons. Okay, why? Because they're related. Those are the two actions you can take instead of them being disparate and set apart. And it's also worth mentioning that I changed the color of the close button because it's not as important as the register button. We'll save that for a later time. That's a whole other speech, but I did want you to make note of that. Another way to accomplish the same thing is to put the labels on top of the fields. And in some cases with short forms, this is even easier because now notice that all the fields are aligned on the left as well. I can absolutely very quickly track straight down this form. And in most cases, again, during usability testing, we find that for short forms, putting the label on top of the field actually results in people being able to complete it a lot faster and also with fewer errors. So in both of these cases, okay, whichever way we decide to treat it, moving the labels and the fields closer together emphasizes the horizontal pairs. The label goes with the field. Label goes with the field. They're pairs of information. They're related because they're close together. The last thing about proximity that I want to impress upon you is the fact that negative space creates proximity. Just like, the physical elements can be moved together to create proximity, the space between them is very important to establishing a sense of proximity. It's usually, in most cases, what determines whether we feel like things are close together or not, okay? So that negative space is incredibly important. Negative space is the space between graphics, margins, gutters, elements, etc. It's the space between columns. It's the space between lines of typography, okay, or visuals. It's that gap, it's that distance, and it's important. You have to be just as conscious of those empty spaces as you do of the things that you fill them with. Negative space is what enables focus. It's not dead space, it's not blank space. It's a critical element of design, and it's something you have to pay attention to. Take a look at this layout. There's a lot of air or negative space around each element. There's a lot of air around the navigation. There's a lot of distance between the navigation and the image below it. But that's what allows us to easily focus on the navigation area, then to easily focus on the product area, and then easily focus on the elements that are underneath it. If you look at this, I think you'll find that it's very simple to sort of shift your focus to each part and quickly get what it is. Now, that's partly because there isn't a whole lot of information on this page, but it's more because the amount of negative space around everything is allowing us to focus on the elements that are there. One of the things that I say to development teams when we're working on projects together, sometimes they're working with a very explicit layout and they have specifications where they know exactly what the pixel distance between elements is supposed to be. But other times when we're working in quick iterations and we're just trying to get stuff down, a lot of times what I'll say is, look, give me 20 pixels of padding between everything, in between every single element, all right? And then I'll adjust from there. The point is, you want to establish some distance between things so that they're easy to read, easy to cognitively grasp, easy to get, easy to focus on. So a good way to start if you're developing something is, just add 10 pixels or 20 pixels of padding between every single element. Start there and then tighten up things maybe as you need to later. But always, always, always start with a decent degree of negative space. Next up, I want to talk about repetition. Repetition doesn't mean probably what it sounds like. It doesn't mean just sort of rubber stamping the same elements over and over and over and over again. it means something a little more subtle than that, okay? And rather than try and explain it to you, I'll give you a visual example. Take a look at this layout. Specifically, let's focus on this main navigation area and two things: the color use that's here and the font styling that's here. Those elements in and of themselves are repeated in different areas. Number one, it's repeated in the style of this Learn More button. We're using the same background color. We're using the same font. The font is in a different color, but that's enough to sort of repeat the same style. What that does is it creates a sense of cohesiveness. It creates a sense that those things, are related in some way. They belong together. That style is also repeated down here in this sub-nav bar, where the same background color is repeated, the same font style is used. Okay, that's the same font. It's used in different sizes, different configuration. Okay, we've got this large number off to the left, and then we've got a smaller word, e-commerce in white or light gray, and then we've got consulting below it, larger in orange. But the overall approach, the overall visual style is very much the same. That's repetition. That's what helps a design to feel cohesive, to feel like all the elements are as they should be. We don't notice that anything is sort of garishly different than anything else. Let's look at another example of repetition in this layout. Take a look at shopping cart development and pay attention particularly to the font style that's used there. That same style is repeated down here. The font is certainly a different size, but notice two things, okay? They're using the same font, number one, but number two, they're also echoing that color of the word cart, same color. And they use the same style in both of those subsequent headlines. It's used again on the right side and request a quote. And again, the same colors are repeated. They're using the color that's used in cart, and then they're also echoing that same orange color of the background. So in this case, this is not a direct relationship. That orange doesn't exist anywhere in shopping cart development, but it does exist in the background of that area. That's what I mean by repetition. We're not just taking the exact same elements and repeating them over and over and over again. We're echoing other parts of the layout. Repetition involves form as well. Take a look at these three icons up top that are in circles. Well, that motif is used again down here underneath these shopping bags. More circles. They're for a different purpose. They allow us to, in this case, look at different slides, so to speak, in the slideshow. But the motif is repeated. That's part of what makes the design feel consistent, feel cohesive, feel well put together. And we also reuse color. Again, in this top nav, this gray color is used in this sort of sub-navigation that appears below it. The orange from the background color appears in the text below it, here and there. So those are all ways to create repetition. And repetition, again, creates a sense of cohesiveness. One of the ways that repetition gets created and implemented is by setting up a series of design patterns once the sort of look and feel phase of the project is complete, right? Once you've settled on your graphic elements and what they're going to look like and what the style is going to be, you then take those styles and apply them to all the other graphic elements, controls, buttons, etc., that you're going to use. Here's an example. If you are an iPhone